Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the United States Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Ensuring Electricity Capacity for the Future: What Works, What Doesn't, and Who's Responsible. We are grateful to the Energy Bar Association, who is our partner in this webinar, as well as to our moderator, John Jimison, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the United States Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest affiliate of the International Association for Energy Economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services you can find at our website at www.usae.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to Jane Ruger, President of the Energy Bar Association, to make a few opening remarks. Jane, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here briefly. And I join in welcoming you all here today to this webinar. We're very excited to be co-hosting it with the USAEE. For those who don't know, the Energy Bar Association has a long, almost 75-year history of supporting energy lawyers and energy professionals who are focused in all matters of the energy sector. And so we are not limited, despite our name, to just lawyers. So we welcome everyone in the energy space. Our focus, as you can see, we offer many member benefits, but our focus is on providing quality programming like you're going to be seeing today from a very wonderful, very top of the, speaking on these issues that are top of mind in a very balanced and accessible way for everyone here today. So we're very excited to be co-hosting again. And we look forward to talking again later. I will turn it over now, I think, to John Jimison, who is our moderator. He's the general counsel with the USAEE, and we look forward to listening in. Take it, John.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, and thank you, David. I have the great pleasure of moderating this panel of diverse experts on our topic. And I think it's because I've served as general counsel to the USAEE on a pro bono basis for 25 years and have been a member of EBA for 30 years. And the reason is that energy economists understand that regulated industries work under their statutes and regulations and experience the economics that result from that. And economists understand that you can't evaluate regulated industries in an economic sense without understanding where those regulations and statutes take those companies. Yet those companies have to compete for capital. They have to compete in their customers' eyes. They have to compete with alternative services, and they have to compete to some extent with free market entry from lots of players. And today we're looking at one of those particular services that is very difficult to approach either from a regulatory standpoint or from a market standpoint, and that is the value of capacity to generate electricity. The reason hundreds of us are able to gather together in real time is because we have access to reliable, high power quality electricity that allows us to see each other on Zoom and use the equipment that makes this possible. But that capacity has an enormous value, but how do you price that value? Who prices it? Who gets paid to provide it? How do they get paid to provide it? Can you use a market and a competitive mechanism to do that? Or is it something that in the public interest a regulator has to set? That's what our panel is going to be talking about, and I'm delighted that we have 4 true experts from different perspectives to offer that evaluation. We're going to start with Julia Freyer, who makes a business of studying the dynamics of markets and who has studied how this particular service fits within the dynamic of markets and basically requires a governmental, legislative, or regulatory role. Then we're going to follow with Pat Wood, who probably needs any introduction to anyone on the line, although detailed introductions of all the panelists are available in the material that went out, and I urge you to review that. Pat has seen the issues of markets and regulation from pinnacles of federal regulation as chair of the FPC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. You can see how long I've been in this business. And from the chair of the State Commission, and from practical work since then in one of the key regional markets, that is Texas. Then we're going to follow with Craig Glazer, who's the Washington rep for PJM Interconnection, the poster child of a regional market that is wrestling with issues of how do you price capacity and make it meaningful to the serving utilities and the customers. And then finally, we're going to conclude with Jay Morrison, who works with the Rural Electric Co-ops, one of the finest FERC lawyers I've ever met, and who basically represents their interest as both end providers and customers of markets who have to provide capacity over the most articulated and distributive system that we have for electricity. So without further ado, we'll go in that order, and I'm going to turn it over to Julia, and we will learn a lot from her about how capacity is viewed from a market perspective.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. And I think today I'd like to continue a little bit about on the theme that you presented us, the symbiosis between markets, which is an economics concept, and regulation, which is necessary and valuable when we don't have markets, or we have incomplete markets or market failure. I'm going to share a few slides, and I'll start by hopefully getting the share screen going. Bear with me as I learn how to use all of this technology well. So at the request of the organizers of the conference, I'm going to give a little bit of a 101, I call it, on capacity markets, and in doing so, perhaps communicate some perspectives and views on the important questions that are arising that we're supposed to be discussing today regarding the pricing of capacity, whether it is best delivered by regulators, best delivered by market structures, and so forth. I should preface that these are my own personal views and thoughts, not that of any of my clients, but I'm happy to delve deeper down the road on any of these. Feel free to contact me if there are any residual questions from this presentation. So first point, and perhaps a really important point from my perspective that has to really serve as a foundation to understanding capacity markets, is that they are not natural markets. They are regulatory constructs by the design. I think we tend to use a lot of economics jargon. We refer to auctions, we refer to supply curves, demand curves when talking about capacity markets, but I like to speak of them as capacity institutions or mechanisms. Now, that's not to mean that these capacity institutions have no value or benefit. It's simply, I think, a reflection of the fact that consumers don't naturally consume capacity like they do electricity. They do pay for capacity, but it's really the system operators that are consuming or utilizing capacity, and they're utilizing it indirectly for purposes of system planning and market operations and insurance, essentially, insurance that they will have sufficient energy to meet demand in the real time. Capacity is sold by generators and other qualified resources, and then consumers are essentially indirectly paying for it. Typically, end users, consumers aren't actually themselves buying capacity on their own. There are constructs for load serving entities and other providers to serve as middlemen in that purchase of capacity, but ultimately it's consumers that pay for it. The regulatory nature, the regulatory construct nature is something that we have to keep in mind, because in a sense what we've seen from many decades of experience with deregulated electricity markets is that capacity is dependent on a set of rules, and regulators tweak or change those rules from time to time. And generally they do so because they observe, once the rules are set up, that there are problems, and attempt to solve those problems or improve upon the efficacy of those capacity constructs. Another thing to keep in mind, that this isn't really free money. There is an underlying benefit or value where the capacity payments received by resources providing capacity aren't just free money. They're usually aligned with a set of obligations to perform, to be available, to be operable, and be able to provide energy when needed. So moving on, after we've established a little bit the concept of market and when and how it applies, I think it's important to do a little bit of a history check and understand, why do we have capacity mechanisms? And I think the answer perhaps takes us all the way back to the vertically integrated era of our industry, where we observed that generators have variable and fixed costs, and we typically designed regulated cost to service mechanisms that reflected remuneration of those variable and fixed costs, and in fact designed tariffs for customers that also reflected a demand charge and a volumetric fuel-based charge. And I think that basic design of the operational profile of generators transferred quite smoothly from the vertically integrated days to our market days and reforms, because most energy markets really started from the premise that we could have markets in the first place, that we could have competition among generators in those energy markets. And I think that has led us down the path of having to have capacity markets. Perfect competition in the energy market essentially dictates, as we all know as economists, that the price of energy should be based on short-run marginal costs. And so thinking about this, we have a situation which I've tried to illustrate here with a visual graphic where generators are essentially assured, as long as they bid in properly, that they will recover their short-run marginal costs or variable costs, as is illustrated by the y-axis. But some generators may not be able to earn any additional economic profit above and beyond those variable costs if they are the marginal or last unit necessary to provide energy to support demand. And that concept of a marginal unit unable to earn profits in a perfectly competitive energy market is really what led us to think about the need for additional mechanisms to remunerate generators to ensure that they won't exit the market. Because as we all know in the economic theory, over time, if a resource, a firm isn't able to cover their fixed costs and variable costs of operation, they will eventually exit the marketplace. So ultimately the purpose or the reason we have capacity mechanisms, in my opinion, stems to some degree to our underlying economic theories about competition in the energy market, and our acknowledgement and recognition that generators do have significant fixed costs of operation that will need to be recuperated or remunerated one way or another. I'm sure many of you have heard the term missing money. I've heard repeatedly in recent weeks, once again, that it's a very negative term, and I'm only using it in a more, I would say, dictionary sense. That's really the purpose of a capacity mechanism. It is to ensure that there is the opportunity for generators to recover both their fixed costs and variable costs, and that becomes extremely important for new generators who are looking to make an investment in the market and haven't yet committed resources. They will want to ensure that there is a pathway for them to recover on an expected basis their total costs, including a reasonable economic profit. So now that we've talked a little bit about the theory, the history lesson, if you will, and my personal views on what is or isn't represented by a capacity market, let's talk a little bit about what we currently have. I like to tell my colleagues and clients that there are many flavors of capacity markets or capacity mechanisms, and this is just a little bit of a sample. We typically categorize capacity mechanisms based on a number of their traits or characteristics. We have auctions or capacity markets, that's the purple. And I'm being a bit unfair. This graphic doesn't include, for example, the auction that occurs for planning reserves in MISO. So this is just an illustration of where these mechanisms exist, but not a comprehensive one. We have areas where we have a capacity obligation, but no underlying organized market to necessarily support it. California ISO is an example where they have their resource adequacy product. We have areas of the world where there's longer term procurement to support resource adequacy and the acquisition of capacity or some flavor of firm energy. And frankly, these different types of capacity mechanisms can also coexist. So going back to California, California does have long-term procurements, which helps ensure that fixed costs for new investors are recovered, but they also have a resource adequacy program for remunerating existing resources in the energy market and retaining those resources. There's also variations on this, like strategic reserves that have been used in parts of Europe, and also outright regulatory constructs where there is a predetermined payment or price for capacity providers. And frankly, we've had experience in the US with that too. In New England for many years, we had a transition payment, which was a predetermined capacity payment that was provided to all qualified capacity suppliers in the market. So what do we take away from this, the many flavors of capacity mechanisms? I think for me, the important lesson is that we've had experience and we've looked at how capacity markets could be designed or capacity mechanisms could be designed. And importantly, I think the key idea is there's no silver bullet. There isn't a single one-size-fits-all design. And it's also important to think about how the capacity mechanisms fit in with other market mechanisms like the notional energy market design and whether they are complementary. The energy market designs between, for example, US markets and those in Europe and South America differ tremendously. And there is, it's quite important to acknowledge that relationship. When we think about capacity mechanisms and have a clean slate for thinking about designing those, we usually use these 7 criteria or characteristics to think about what kind of market would or would not work with the other institutions in play and parameters. We think about whether the capacity mechanism would be market-wide, whether it would have certain limitations on which technology or what kind of resources qualify. We think about whether the policymakers would be determining the price or determining the procurement target or volume of capacity necessary, and how capacity would be procured or contracted, whether it would be through organized, centralized mechanisms or decentralized mechanisms. And the list goes on to consider also the parameters for setting the price, the perspective on procurement and willingness to pay for capacity, and also over what time dimension capacity is purchased. The reason I'm introducing these 7 features is because it's quite important to understand that we've observed a variety of market outcomes for capacity markets: low prices and high prices, markets that have created opportunities, or I should say mechanisms again, that have created opportunities for investments, and mechanisms that have retained existing generation but not necessarily incentivize new build. And I think ultimately, and this is my last slide, the reason we see such a mix of outcomes it is not because necessarily of the fundamentals, the amount of supply and demand in a given region, but precisely because of the administrative or regulatory choices that are being made in the design of those capacity markets. And as the illustration suggests, the devil is in the detail, or as I like to say, it's very important to understand all the nuances of capacity constructs and institutions. They are not all the same, and they by virtue of those differences do create a variety of outcomes with respect to the ability to retain resources, with the respect also to the ability to trigger investments. So finally, what does this really mean for the future? I know this panel is going to be debating quite a bit about what kind of capacity mechanism or market or regulation we need for the future. Well, again, I don't think we've come across a single winning design. I think once we recognize that capacity markets are not natural markets and acknowledge the need for regulation, then it really is about a balance and making sure that we stay the course in terms of ensuring that whatever regulatory rules and supportive market platforms we create, that they ultimately can deliver on the objectives behind the capacity market. In my mind, as we move through the next 10 or 20-year evolution of the electricity sector, we will need significant amounts of investment, in part because we do have an aging generation fleet, and then also in part because of technology change and the variety of new investments we have now available for consumers, and the policy goals for decarbonization. So I don't think the question of capacity constructs will necessarily go away if we intend to incentivize all that investment through market paradigms. So we need to continue pushing it. But I also think there may be opportunities down the road to rethink the type of capacity institutions we've had to date, because we need to really think about not just capacity as a standalone, but capacity and energy. And as our energy markets are changing, we may need to rethink capacity as well. And we need to involve as well the customer side of the experience. Customers have received the benefit of capacity markets and reliability. They have paid for it, but they haven't really been engaged in wholesale capacity markets and institutions. And as just as a reminder, perhaps the model that we have based all of our decisions, that fixed and variable cost model, the presumption of perfect competition to dictate what we think is reasonable for the energy market, those economic models and thinking need to evolve as they have in other industries. Let's take the phone service or internet service. We don't pay for internet service on the basis of megabits or for phone service based on the minutes of phone calls we place. We pay a monthly charge. So in my mind, it may mean that customers over time may develop a different appetite for buying electricity. And as a result of that, our views on how we procure electricity through energy and capacity market institutions may need to evolve to catch up with the needs of consumers.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you for your wonderful introduction to the topic and to the economic analysis that has to be part of our approach to it. I'm going to quickly move to Pat Wood, and while I do, I want to remind all the participants that you can begin posing questions in the question and answer box of your Zoom screen. I know a number of leading energy economists have already discovered that and posed some tough ones, and but I haven't seen any lawyers do that yet, so don't fall behind, you EBA members. Without further ado, Pat, it's a real honor to have you join us on this webinar and to benefit from the experience that you've had in the past and that which you are currently still gathering. So please take it away.
Good. Thanks, John. And it sure is great to follow Julia on this because she set the groundwork. I wanted to give my perspective. I've kind of been on a bunch of sides. Judy Collins was on 2, but I think I've added a couple more. But I've been, retail and wholesale regulator, PUCT in Texas, retail and wholesale, and then wholesale only at FERC. I was a vertically integrated utility regulator for most of my stay in Texas, but toward the end got to, like Moses, see the promised land of the retail competitive world, and of course lived under that. As chairman of Dynegy in the past decade, I got to play in capacity markets in PJM, New England, and in MISO, so have some stripes on my back from those experiences. And then, live now in ERCOT building a storage network across the state and living in a energy only market. So have some experience from that, both as a supplier, but also fundamentally, which is the way I was a regulator, looking at this from the customer point of view. So as you all know, you saw the map here. I have my fingerprints in most of these, except for probably the Ontario market. Not so much Alberta either, but I also left over here something that's happened since I left, which is the creeping day one markets out in the West, which are interesting, but obviously do not have a capacity component, so I won't delve into that. I kind of tend to think of capacity markets, and we've had this debate in Texas, in a different model down here. As really an answer to one big question: who bears the cost of the excess generation investment? And excess is not a bad word. It's the insurance policy. How do you pay for insurance? Obviously, in the vertically integrated world, that is and has been decided by regulators, other policymakers, and placed on the back of the captive customer. In the ERCOT market, we've now moved to, and I put stars here because there are variations across the world, but by and large, it's kind of a continuum between vertically integrated as the pure example on this end, and ERCOT as where the market bears the risk. So that market can be a cooperative or muni, which are still vertically integrated little islands in the ERCOT Sea, or you could be individual customers. Depending on how they want to insure themselves, they can get a retailer. That's what I put here as the indent here is they're low barriers to entry for retailers. It's not a natural monopoly, so why do we need to treat it as one? And so that retail customer book, the retailer, which has got a pretty good financial backing requirements now implemented by the commission that have been beefed up over the years, that is effectively a voluntary capacity market. If you want to have your self protected in a capacity environment, then in a tight environment, then you would want to have a retailer that has the book to do that. Others want to take a chance, and they're happy to let their retailer go under. So that has happened a few times in the past decade and a half. But by and large, we've got to the point where, from the customer side, the capacity market issue down here has not really been triggered as a necessary. We've gotten the necessary investment. We've gotten close. Last summer was an interesting test of the system. The commission, as a kind of an insurance policy, just to make sure, did a very light version of a capacity market, which is the ORDC. I'll show you that in a sec. But it effectively is a bit of a regulatory intervention. You know, as a regulator, trying to undo a century of regulation was a challenge. And so there will be some, I think Julia called them regulatory constructs that are necessary. I guess I viewed my charge, certainly as a retail regulator, is to try to minimize the need for those many regulatory constructs. But the ORDC is a gamble because, quite frankly, you don't want to throw out the benefits of a well-functioning competitive market by not having enough generation online. And there are a few things that we've been missing, and I'll do those in one picture here in a sec. Other organized markets, which we got my good friend Craig Glazier from PJM to talk about that, are in between. So it's kind of a rheostat toggling that knowledge. My bottom line is, if you need something for future reliability, define it and procure that. I'm, was certainly a defender as chairman of Dynegy of steel on the ground view of capacity markets. But, stepping back from that, I do think a more forward-looking design is more important to think about going forward. This is the ORDC, just in general, as the capacity gets tight, moving from right to left, there is an artificial adder to the market because it tends to be a step function market otherwise. So this slope here in multiple colors is what is being added. The red number is what was being added last year. The top line, which is grayish blue, is what is going to be actually the adder. You'll see that's an adder to the megawatt hour price. The high energy charge at $9,000 per megawatt hour, $9 per kilowatt hour instead of 2 cents, is a significant incentive for a load serving entity, whether it's a regulated one like a co-op or a muni, or a competitive one like a retail electric provider, to procure their supplies bilaterally. So the fundamental capacity market structure here is much like it was in the early days of all capacity structures in the US, an obligation that was imposed from the outside that you fulfilled bilaterally. Two things are missing in that past era that I found as a regulator going forward, we really had to have. I also oversaw as a staffer for one of the commissioners at FERC during the gas dereg, saw that storage and price responsive demand in the gas industry were very fundamental in allowing a more competitive regime to take place. We didn't have that until very recently. We very pervasively in the electric power industry, but the ability now to have storage, you see it's certainly become much more cost effective. This is the Lazard slide from last year's deck. It's come way down, just like wind and solar costs have come down before it. So it's now competitive, and really just in the last 24 months, I would say it's become a legitimate tool that those of us who care about markets can rely upon as a long-term supplier. And then the ability, as we've seen, the technology that's popped up out of, quite frankly, Silicon Valley, a lot of it, but across the country, as we see both, and these are two that I happen to have in my house, but smart appliances inside your premises, whether it's an office or industrial plant or residence, those have been around for a while, but that integration of those with kind of a smart market design. This is just an example where I see things going. I happen to be a supplier, or my supplier here in Texas is a company called Gritty. They basically pass through the ERCOT hourly, or really the 15-minute price to me. In fact, just about an hour before this call, I got a notice that there's a little price spike this morning for 38 cents a kilowatt hour, which is again about 20 times what it usually is. So I got this little notice here on the left. That one is a normal day. And there was a spike last Friday. As usual, on Friday afternoons in the summer, it gets hot. So you'll see right there, the price was 23 cents a kilowatt hour. So I responded, turned the air conditioners up from 72 to 78, and my supply went down. As you'll see on the far right, I used very little in the afternoon. Even though we're stay at home right now during the COVID era, you can, and I happen to have a battery, which is the key savior for me here. People won't do this, you won't get 50% uptake of this, but you have a 10% or so discipline in the market at residential. You've already got this and have had it for years at industrial level. I do think that we'll see a significant use of these tools here, of customers responding in real time, so that the need for capacity obligations to be imposed upon customers from the outside, by whether that be by regulators or the grid operator, that is reduced, because we've got this ability now to have really non-vertical demand curves. You've got very fluid demand curves, much like we have in most every other commodity, because we have this wonderful opportunity called storage. And we've got this ability for customers to respond in real time with demand. Again, I don't think it needs to be across the board, but having customers play in a way that they've never played before is really where this grid's moving. And so I like to kind of think about, where is the grid moving? So at the end of the century, and that used to sound like so long ago, I had this slide made before I was even chairman of FERC, and it's changed. I've done different clip art over the years of things has changed, but my 2020 version of this is really the grid we're moving toward. And I think that the kind of capacity market that I've talked about, the Texas model, if it evolves that way elsewhere, it's going to result in a much more modular, lower cost, don't bet the bank, kind of like Southern building another Vogtle. That would not happen in the kind of market that we have in ERCOT, for example. I think the more modular, better allocation of risk design that is going to be the nature going forward will be what we see. So you'll see small nukes here, wind and solar, much as they are now. I think obviously the technological advances in those, just in my short career since FERC, the past 15 years, has been substantial improvements in both of those technologies. There'll be others possibly relating to tidal flow, and geothermal's always been around. Much more electrified transportation. So we'll have a lot more usage of the grid in a different way than before, which will necessitate and actually augment the storage. If you have a two-way battery on that car, that's a pretty interesting device than as opposed to now that just take it one way. And in the course, that bottom right box is really where I think we haven't tapped at all. And that's allowing customers to participate in the market. It really obviates and hops all the way over these regulatory constructs, as Julia defined them, that have created such conundrums for those of us in the capacity markets. Look forward to answering any questions and participating in the debate. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Pat. That's a terrific view from a regulator's and a practitioner's point of view, and a very future-oriented one. So now we're going to turn to Craig Glazer. Craig is handicapped because he has to use his iPad to show his slides, because the security issues with Zoom preclude him from doing it on his computer, but we'll hope it works, and we'll hope PJM continues to work as a major regional market for a number of sub-jurisdictions. Craig, take it away.
All right, thank you, John, and hopefully are the slides coming up, hopefully as well. One second here. Yeah, are they coming up?
They are.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you. Monty Python used to say now for something completely different. So the portion of the program that Julia and Pat did, I call the sort of gentler and kinder discussion of the capacity markets. But when everybody starts talking about PJM capacity markets, the hot rotating knives tend to come out. And I'm sure I'm not going to expect those from here. So we're kind of used to that. And frankly, we're in many ways our own harshest critics as well. So, but I do appreciate that. I entitled this, Looking Back to Look Forward. And I did that for a reason. Hopefully you can see the slides. Because anybody knows me, I'm a great student of history. I love history. And I always believe that before we go to change something, we need to look back to why did, in many cases, people at this seminar, Pat Wood, Jay, myself, others that were involved in those discussions from the get-go, why were changes made? Why did we do this? And before you look to change it, I always thought you have to at least understand, doesn't mean you don't change it, understand what was the reason why this came about. So let me, I'll skip over the map of PJM and go to just a little bit of history. I feel like this is sort of the book of Genesis here. But we started, like many regions of the country, with traditional vertically integrated regulation, generation and rate base. And that provided, that's what rate of return regulation, which I used to do like Pat did, that's what provided the long-term price signal for many years. Well, along came retail choice in our region, and suddenly the obligation, I remember in my legislature, suddenly the obligation to provide capacity, to have that there, was now distributed. If anything, it was sort of a bit silent as to who was required to provide what. And we originally started in PJM with a system where just, you're a new LSC, you've got new customers, bring us capacity. Here's what we need, bring us capacity. And we had a daily residual capacity market. One of the issues there was it was sort of a boom bust type market. There really wasn't much of a forward price signal. And that then had some interesting consequences both for customers as well as for investors. So we moved to the now controversial, always controversial, 3-year forward market. During that, and as part of that evolution, we actually incorporated demand response and energy efficiency, which I think was a real win for our customers in that we, for the first time, were able to monetize demand response and energy efficiency. And I can tell you, on a hot summer day like today, the dispatcher is indifferent whether they call a new generator to fire up or call demand response. But both of them are being sort of monetized and treated the same. We added capacity performance to clarify the obligation. And of course, at the end, we had the now infamous MOPR, which hopefully we can not have the entire discussion about, because I think there's some bigger issues. What were we trying to do? Well, one of them is long-term locational investment signals. And I'd like to posit, because we're going to hear a lot about the discussion is, well, why don't you just have a bilateral market, let people bring what they want to the market. And actually, at least as an original design, we can argue whether this actually occurred and why it did or why it didn't. The concept was that this is kind of a false debate, because the original concept, if I can go ahead, was that you would have long-term PPAs, that the capacity market would provide a price signal, but that nothing in that capacity market stood in the way of willing buyers and willing sellers, let's put state-regulated mandates aside for the moment, would enter into contracts for differences. That was the concept for longer term, and that would provide both a hedging mechanism as well as a way to fund investment longer term. That was the concept. So we can argue whether it worked or not, but I think just having a debate bilateral versus centralized procurement is a bit of a false debate in that. Other aspects were clearly a forward closure signal for inefficient units, which I think that has actually worked well. Some degree of competition, certainly in procurement of capacity. We've talked about revenue stability, some way to monetize and address the upfront costs of new technology and non-discrimination. I won't take a great deal of time, but on this slide are the attributes of the PJM capacity market design. This is what we designed to meet those goals. And then the question is, so, well, how has it worked? And I think it's relevant, particularly on a hot day like today. I'm not here to tell you this is not without issues. We have had lots of new entry. The good news stories, we've had lots of new entry, and we have changed over and cleaned up the fleet in a matter of a few years. I was a state regulator. It would take a decade to change the fleet over, But as a result, when the MATS rule, the EPA MATS rule came in, suddenly we were able to literally change over the fleet in 3 years. We saw a large number of inefficient coal units get the signal to retire and retire. We saw a lot of clean new units come in, cleaner new units, a lot of natural gas units. Now, we have excess capacity on the system as a result. You can argue why we have that. It may be a function of low prices. It may be a function of people who are exuberance on the part of investors about the natural shale revolution. There's a lot of speculation about that, but there's no question that the fleet has cleaned up and transformed in a very short time, as illustrated by the next chart, where you can see that the really we've had a switch over in coal and gas, and incredibly, certainly a rising amount of renewables, and we could talk more about renewables in this. Okay, let's talk about prices. Prices in this market have bounced around. This sort of looks like my EKG when I talk about capacity markets, because prices have bounced around. And they bounced around for a couple, I'm not proud of this at all. They bounced around for a couple of reasons. One is we've made lots of changes along the way. All those changes were not helpful to providing a signal, but arguably they were needed. Number two, the market is incredibly sensitive to system topology. A new transmission line really can have a significant impact on locational prices and even RTO-wide prices. And the slope of the demand curve, which is heavily negotiated, something as wonky as that, has a big impact on the slope of volatility of the market. I'll just close, because we've got a short amount of time here, to say there's a lot of issues here. As I said, we're our own precious critics. One of the fundamental premises of the market is that all megawatts are the same. And frankly, on a day like today, in our control room, the dispatcher just needs megawatts. And he or she relies on public policy to impose whatever requirements it has in the way of environmental or labor laws or whatever, and those to be reflected in the bids. But on a day like today, they just want megawatts. Or negawatts in the case of demand reduction. But states clearly don't view all megawatts the same, and clearly are not looking necessarily to do this with some system-wide, region-wide carbon cap, at least for the moment. So that's a complication. How the states make those choices is a complication. We think the market has accomplished a fair amount today, but we are certainly open to discussion. There's a lot of issues, I'm sure many that Jay will talk about in a moment, with regard to where we go from here. So let me close with that, a little bit of history, and let you move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Craig. That was truly a high wattage presentation, and very much appreciated. So now we will move to Jay Morrison and get the viewpoint of his representation of some 800 or so utilities that own their own systems and basically have the same desire to provide high reliability over very attenuated distribution systems that all other utilities do, and get Jay's perspective on how you provide the capacity that ensures that reliability.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate on such an amazing panel. This is a remarkable group, so thank you very much for having me. I'd like to address a lot of the same questions that the other speakers have addressed. I'd like to lay out a couple of key principles that I see as guiding our direction on capacity markets, and then answer very specifically, but briefly, the questions that were in the advertising materials that I think help to get us into a little bit more detail on those principles. But before I do that, I'd like to start by talking about three of my hobbies. They're totally unrelated to energy, but I think you'll see how it comes back around to the topic at hand. My first hobby is carpentry. I love to work in the wood shop in my garage. If I go to homedepot.com to buy a hammer, and I have about a dozen different hammers for different purposes, I find 27 different pages of hammers there of widely ranging prices. They serve hundreds of different needs. No matter what project I might need to do, there is a separate hammer that's perfectly designed for that project. My wife thinks I want to buy them all, but I so far only have the dozen. Second hobby, which is really more my wife's hobby, is gardening. She has probably 80 to 90 tomato plants in the ground right now. Fortunately, we do not have 360 varieties of tomatoes in the ground right now. I don't have time to do that much canning this summer. But there is a tomato for every purpose. Whatever your taste is, however you cook, there is a specific tomato to meet that purpose. My third hobby that I haven't been able to do nearly enough since the kids were born, starting almost 15 years ago, is horseback riding. I was generally trail riding. I had roping saddle, which was very good for that, but there is a trail riding saddle. No matter what your sport is around horses, there is a specific saddle for that purpose. And there are dozens of different companies that make different varieties of each of the saddles for that purpose, because no one saddle can do everything that somebody might do on the back of a horse. Now, the value of these examples of my hobbies is that they talk about the benefit of a competitive market. You have many customers, each of whom has different needs. They want something different or some combination of things for a different purpose. I might use 3 different hammers on the same job, depending on where I am in the job. But thank goodness there are many different competitors competing for my business, trying to get me to spend the money my wife would rather I was spending on tomatoes on their hammer. That's what makes a really successful competitive market. You would expect the same level of complexity in terms of offerings and needs in our industry. We are trying to manage the largest and most complex machine ever built, and a machine that is affected with the public interest, as the Federal Power Act has been telling us for a very long time. The federal government, the states, consumers are very, very interested in how we provide energy in order to make sure that we meet a wide range of public interests. That can be seen in the things that cooperatives are looking to manage and balance as they're buying resources, whether they're building them themselves or whether they're contracting for them. We're managing a wide range of risks, and we're managing to a wide range of regulatory and consumer expectations. Capacity isn't just this concept that floats around in space. Capacity is one value that comes from real iron in the ground, real resources that provide capacity, but also have a wide range of other risks and benefits, opportunities with each one. One resource is going to be better on price. One resource is going to be better on emissions. One resource is going to be more flexible. And you're going to be getting a collection of resources that provides you with the right balance of the things that you need to provide your consumers and your regulators. Capacity is one of the things that you're buying from this real iron in the ground, whether it's a power plant or whether it's a controllable water heater. It is a real asset that is providing the capacity, and the capacity is only one part of the investment decision. And yet, as Craig said, in the RTO centralized capacity markets, as he said, quote, the fundamental premise is that all megawatts are the same. And so the one thing that they're acquiring is capacity. I can go into Home Depot and buy a whole lot wider range of hammers than I can go into PJM and get a wider range of capacity. Now, as Craig said, and we'll get to this a little bit later, there should be a bilateral market. The RTO market should be working side by side with a bilateral market that allows me or my members to acquire the resources I need to meet all of these needs. But the centralized market itself is just acquiring this one resource. We need capacity mechanisms, whether they're centralized, whether they're dispersed, whatever the mechanism that enables us to meet our wide range of obligations. And those obligations are going to be different for every one of my 900 members, depending on what their consumers, their regulators want, depending on what their risks are in their part of the country. So a couple of very simple principles for what we're looking for in a capacity market capacity arrangement. First, give us the obligation, which we've always had, but not every LSE has, to manage the risks and acquire the capacity required to meet those regulatory and consumer expectations. Once we have the obligation, we will go out and we will go shopping for those resources. Second, ensure open, non-discriminatory access to transmission that is planned to meet our needs so that we can actually physically access the resources that meet our needs. Third, eliminate market power so that the suppliers can actually compete to meet those needs so that more than just the immediately neighboring entity is capable of delivering the options or our members' options in order to provide the service that we're expected to provide. And then get out of the way. The market design shouldn't make it harder for us to meet our obligations. It should make it easier. One of the things we need to do in that market design is make the rules simple enough to avoid gaming and procedural and regulatory capture. On the left is the PJM Open Access Transmission Tariff, its operating manuals and its operating agreements, 16 inches thick of paper. On the right is the EEI Master Power Purchase and Sale Agreement that many entities use for their bilateral transactions in energy and capacity. Now, this may look like an unfair comparison. Obviously, you're going to need to buy transmission from somebody to get power delivered on that bilateral sale. That's going to require an open access transmission tariff. So I went online to compare. The PJM OAT is 3,623 pages. That's just the OAT on here. It's not all the rest of the operating agreements and manuals. The Southern Company OAT is still very long at 805 pages. The difference between 3,600 and 800 is the level of complexity. And that complexity makes it possible for folks to game. And every page in that OAT is negotiated in a stakeholder process that some entities have more resources to participate in than others. And every page of that is going to be litigated at FERC by entities with different economic interests. So where is there greater opportunity for market power, whether that's regulatory market power or economic market power? Where is the competition taking place? Is it taking place in providing a better product at a lower price, or is it competition in defining the rules to advantage a particular competitor's product? This is not to say that PJM is bad. RTOs have tremendous value. In the areas where they're operating, they can eliminate tremendous amounts of market power. They can provide open access transmission service. They can eliminate discrimination. Their real-time and near real-time operations are enormously valuable in ensuring competition. The question is then whether you also want to ask them to be the centralized procurer of capacity. Is that a good job for them? And the answer is maybe, if they can do it in a way that gets out of the way of the load serving entities need to be able to acquire the resources that allow them to meet their obligations. To get into some more detail on that, let me very quickly answer some of the questions that were in the advertised materials. First, where is the line between state and FERC RTO responsibility? Let me suggest that FERC should ensure open access. They should eliminate market power to enable competition to keep wholesale power rates just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory. That's an enormously important role. RTOs play an enormously important role in that, in their real-time and near real-time operations. State and local regulators, frankly, should manage all the rest. including decisions about which resources should be acquired, which are the right ones, how do we best serve local consumers. This is a chart that I put together for a Public Utility Fortnightly article a couple of years ago. I tried to suggest the hierarchy in control and responsibility. Retail consumers at the top, then state and local regulators who need to be responsive to those retail customers. They are their political representative. They are the voice of the consumers qua voters. Then the load serving entities who are given directions by their customers and by their regulators. And then the markets, whether those are the bilateral markets or the RTO markets, they should be there to enable the load serving entities to then meet the expectations of their state and local regulators and their retail customers. Unfortunately, that pyramid has been inverted in some places. Craig was mentioning that when PJM capacity market was started, that it was intended to be parallel to and supportive of and supported by the bilateral markets, and it was. It was a residual capacity construct. After the utilities had acquired the resources that they wanted or that their states told them to get, then you had a market for the residual, for the remainder. Over the course of litigation over the last 5, 8, 10 years, that has slowly changed and become less and less so. And the decisions of the retail customers, the state and local regulators, the load serving entities have become second to the needs of the RTO markets as opposed to the other way around. In our view, the wholesale customers, the load serving entities, are the linchpin that hold together the state and the federal. On the state side is retail, is distribution, is decisions about what resources, whether it's the environmental characteristics of those resources or the level of reliability expected by customers beyond the basics required by NERC, for example. The choices about how we're going to serve customers are at the state level. At the wholesale level, FERC is supposed to ensure that there is a competitive market to make it possible for the wholesale customers to acquire the resources that the states and the retail customers want. How should we treat variable wind and solar in a capacity market? Fairly. That should be pretty basic. They should be given credit to the extent that they provide capacity value. And if we want to buy renewable resources, if we're required by our states to buy renewable resources, even if those happen to be terribly expensive compared to other capacity resources out there, we shouldn't have to pay twice for the capacity. That's just nuts. That is the states and utilities serving the RTO, not the RTO serving the states and the consumers. Would greater interregional transmission capacity help? Yes, if it better enables us to meet the long-term needs of our consumers. Congress agreed with that in 2005 Energy Policy Act. They added section 217B4, which said that transmission should be planned, that the commission should exercise all of its authority under the statute to ensure that transmission is planned to meet the needs of LSEs as they serve their consumers. Unfortunately, this language has become a dead letter. FERC explained it away, and the courts have allowed that to happen. What role should the demand side play in ensuring adequate capacity? It should play a role. It has always played a role as demand, not as supply. The key rule here, though, is that demand response rules should enable LSEs to use demand response to manage risk and meet the expectations of their consumers and regulators. Hopefully you're seeing a pattern here. The rules, as Julia had said, the capacity market should be designed for a goal. In our view, that goal should be to enable us to manage risk and meet the expectations of our consumers and regulators. FERC recognized that, appreciated that, adopted rules in 719A that enabled it by allowing the local utilities to manage demand response where their regulator decided that was appropriate. Unfortunately, FERC chose not to do that in its storage rule, and we're still not sure what they're going to do in the DER rule. We hope, again, that they show respect, as they did in 719A, to the local regulators' decisions about how to serve. Capacity auctions versus the Texas model can both assure adequacy when supplies get tight. My question is, can either? Is somebody been given the obligation to provide enough capacity? Does the market allow them to then meet that obligation and get out of the way? It's not clear that either the auctions, as FERC now envisions the PJM auction, where state and utility choices are disfavored, is going to get us there. And given how tight capacity has been the last 2 Texas summers, I hope that model can ensure capacity adequacy. That's going to be interesting to see. Will the transition to digitized smart power system control and monitoring help or hurt? It will help. It will absolutely help. Again, if the rules permit LSEs to use the tech to manage risk and meet the expectations of their consumers and regulators. They have been. They're using smart grid very aggressively in a lot of places to be able to manage load so that when power is expensive or short, that they can reduce their load, that they can better serve their consumers, better meet the needs of their members, their regulators, and the system. So that just takes us back to the principles, and I will yield back the time I don't have.
Well, thank you, Jay. But you used the time that you had and that you didn't very well, and we very much appreciate it. Now, we do have a few scheduled minutes left, and I know I am willing, I'm not sure whether I'm not going to speak for any of the other panelists, to stay on a few additional minutes because we've had a number of truly insightful questions and a number that panelists have already signaled they would be happy to answer live, and I don't think we're going to have time to get to all of them. But what I'd like to do is to ask each of the panelists to pick one really trenchant question that they think deserves a live answer and to provide that in the next few minutes. Then, of course, I have questions and there'll be more coming in. But at this time, we're supposed to be ending at 2:15. It is now, according to my watch, 2:08. We need more time than that to even, I think, get through the first few questions. So I'd like to propose that we go to 2:30. I can see most of the panelists shake your head no or nod it yes if you're going to be available to stay with us. Okay, I think I don't see Craig, but I'm assuming his bearded head is nodding yes.
Yes.
So why don't we start with you and let you pick one of the questions you've indicated you'd like to answer live. Pick the toughest, pick the hardest one to answer.
I was hoping you'd actually ask me the question, but
We're starting with Julia, Craig.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
You can go, Craig. I'm happy for you to jump in. I can jump in.
Go ahead. Go for it.
I saw a couple of questions come in throughout the discussion about the acknowledgement or recognition that we're seeing a big changeover in our generation fleet. We're having variable or intermittent resources joining our generation fleet and conventional dispatchable resources exiting our generation fleet. I think that's come up, and it was actually one of the questions we were going to discuss. What happens with all these intermittent resources? Do we still need a capacity market? My response is, I think we need a construct of some sort that remunerates and I'll use missing money in a positive sense. So for all those who don't like the term, but allows for remuneration of missing money, because even those renewable investments cannot recover their full expected return on and of capital from an energy market alone. And to the extent they may, it's so unexpected, so volatile and uncertain that they can't actually commit to making the investments unless they have a mechanism. Now, that mechanism doesn't necessarily need to be a standalone capacity market like we've seen to date. And maybe going back to my ice cream flavors, maybe we do need to think outside the box and think of additional variations on the concept of capacity. And I would suggest we really need to go back to the original premise of markets. Markets were created, or the reforms that led to markets were created really to allow us to get to more efficient investment and a better allocation of risks. So those that could take on risks should take those on. Those who couldn't take on risks should look for insurance products to allow them for a different risk profile. And I think originally, if we go back to vertically integrated days, it was the utilities that were taking on certain investment risks, but essentially passing those costs on to consumers. The markets were supposed to change that. They were supposed to put investment risk back on investors. But I think essentially they're still creating a flow of funds where customers are paying for it. I think the answer to many of our questions, and it's not going to come easy, we're going to have to take it slow, is to rethink about how technology has not only changed our generation fleet, but how technology has changed the consumer's ability to engage in these markets. In really blurring of the retail and wholesale lines that we have, I think 20 years ago, we didn't have the smart devices that allowed consumers to engage. Now we do. Consumers can provide their own capacity. Consumers, as Jay mentioned, could decide that they're not willing to have the same type of reliability. They don't want to pay for it that their neighbors have. And technology has started to evolve both on the transmission and distribution grid side with AMIs, and also importantly from a legal and regulatory perspective, we are moving in the direction of being able to acknowledge the individual customer and the choices they make, and to be able to segregate. So we no longer have the same problems with a single network with a lot of free riding. So I think that for me is the answer to it. We need capacity constructs, but they may look very different from what we have today.
Well, thank you. I want to turn to Pat because he proved that he himself is a responsive consumer and has made the case that, in fact, consumers can play a major role in capacity markets. In fact, one of the questions that came in, I thought was a good one, is can you have consumers play a role in the market if it's not the capacity market? Where else do consumers actually get to play? So, Pat, I don't know if that's the question you picked out, but I'd be happy to have you answer either that one or the one you picked out.
You know, I mean, again, by reducing demand, are effectively liberating supply. So it is a continuum. And I think somebody in a different question pointed that out. Anonymous attendee asked a question about storage can facilitate retail demand, but it involves CapEx. But what about customers selectively curtailing load? I mean, demand response, as our friend Amory Levins has said, from every mountaintop he can ever climb, is the cheapest and most widely available solution to all of these things. And so we've got a lot of efficiency still to wrangle out of our system. Shifting demand is certainly the easiest. I mean, that we're going to get past that. I mean, I'm sure mid-century we won't be talking about peak of the day demand. It'll be, we're already seeing, and certainly in the California market with the duck curve, we're getting what's called the armadillo curve in Texas. Don't explain to me. I've never had anybody explain to me a good reason why we have to call it something different than a duck, because we got ducks there too. But nonetheless, these unusual dispatch curves, we're going to see that throughout the rest of the century. It's going to be all over the map. It won't be that peak in the afternoon at 4 p.m. kind of stuff that we've had in Texas for, a century. So it will look very different, the demand curve. And I think using customer demand responses, certainly came late to me. I mean, as the regulator for 25 years, you think I would have drunk this in my Kool-Aid, but it wasn't until one night I walked around with a sick kid and I was looking at all these incandescent lights overhead and thinking, God, that's pretty damn inefficient. So it comes to you when it comes to you, but it's definitely slugged me over the head now that I'm living in the real-time market in ERCOT. So I think that kind of exposure, and I do hope that, as one of the other questions pointed, I do hope that state regulators will, quote, liberate, if the customers are still in prison, if they'll liberate them to at least go out and have real-time pricing opportunities, because you avoid high costs, but you also can charge your electric vehicle at night. And as we have more and more deployment of electric vehicles and nighttime prices tend to be lower than daytime prices, you come out ahead. I charge that old car of mine pretty damn cheap in the middle of the night. Some days I get paid to charge it because it's negative pricing due to the federal tax subsidy that still's here.
Thank you, Pat. Okay, well, Craig, we'll turn to you and let you pick the question PJM least wants you to answer online.
So I'm going to touch on this question that Jay raised and a number of people raised about, this get out of the way concept. Because again, going back to history, one of the reasons we did this was to have a long-term price signal. We have a lot of PPAs in PJM. So the idea behind the fact that people can write contract for differences is still there and always has been part of it.
Whoa, I'm not sure if Craig hit a wrong button or something, but I think there he is.
Can you hear me? Am I back?
Now we can again.
All right, somebody was calling me, telling me not to answer this question. So. They knew, they were watching it in real time. But so a corner just near my house, there's 3 gas stations. And there are prices posted at each gas station. And just having that price available allows me to make a decision whether I want to buy gas from one of those 3 or keep driving, okay? If there were no prices, if there was no price signal, I'd have to go knock on the door of each gas station and ask them to negotiate for me a price. I'm not sure that could work. I would still eventually get gas, but it would not be a terribly efficient system. It's a price signal. It was not intended to be, and I don't believe it is today, the final price, and that precludes people from entering into long-term PPAs. That being said, there's a lot of issues here. FERC slayed a lot of issues, more than we can talk about in this time, and we do want to engage in a discussion on new ways to potentially look at this. I'll close with that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Craig. And so, Jay, you haven't had as much time as the others to review the questions that you would like to answer, but I want to turn to you and see what further getting things out of the way you'd like to propose.
Thank you. That's okay that I haven't had the time, because I actually want to address Robert Borlick's very first question. But first, let me just thank Craig and PJM, because they have been supportive in the most recent litigation to try and push back on this FERC Commission's greatest excesses in terms of trying to drive everybody and everything into the centralized market as opposed to the bilateral market. So I've appreciated that PJM has recognized the value of that parallel market, the bilateral market. So that's been a very good thing, and we've been allies on that. And that relates very much to Robert's first question, which is, what about missing money? And I'd like to suggest that missing money is a myth. Missing money is a myth that was developed by some of those engaged procedural and regulatory capture that I described. To get there, let me go back to Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine, which I think we had described, and go back to the start of these markets, which really is back into the early 90s, late 80s, as opposed to really the formation of the RTOs. Why did we move to competition? And I would say that it wasn't really about shifting risk from consumers to investors. It was about allowing competitive forces to drive down costs and improve the quality of service. When we opened up the transmission system, first with 211 and then with Order 888, we drove a lot of bad generation out of the market. We forced a lot of generation to become a lot more efficient. We brought in new resources that were a lot more efficient. That was, at that point, an entirely bilateral market, but it was far more competitive than it had been in the past, and that was of enormous value to consumers. We brought the RTOs in then to continue that process of driving out the market power, driving out the discrimination, enabling the open access that again provided that competition that drove costs down and improved the quality of products. I could get into the whole concept of risk shifting, but I'm going to focus on the missing money piece. Missing money arrived when some folks decided that the RTO markets weren't there about driving competition, weren't there about open access, weren't there just about providing the transmission service in a non-unduly discriminatory fashion so that buyers and sellers could reach each other. Sorry for all the double negatives. The statute makes that hard. But rather that the market should be the be-all and end-all, that they should be not just a price signal that drives decisions in the market, but rather the place where all of the revenue can be found. And this language is not found in what Craig or PJM has been filing, but is found in a lot of the economic literature and pleadings and decisions that have been around this debate on the design of the wholesale market. If all of the revenue needs to be in the centralized market, if a purely competitive player that wants to be just in the centralized market and not the bilateral market can't get all of their revenue out of the energy market, well, then there's missing money and they need to be able to get it out of another market in the centralized market. In fact, most investors know that that's nuts. Most investors are looking for bilateral contracts, longer term arrangements, the kinds of financial hedges that Craig was talking about to make sure that their investors get back at least most of their money. They're not going to be gambling entirely. But this myth that all of the money required to support a competitive investment needs to be in the RTO market's various revenue options is what has driven the litigation around the PJM, New York, and New England capacity market designs to try and push out anything that might reduce the amount of money available in those markets, push up the amount of money available in those markets, to push out the entities that aren't relying on those markets entirely for revenue. This is why any state-supported resource is now considered subsidized, why any resource invested in because of an RPS is considered subsidized, why any resource invested in by a cooperative or a muni is considered subsidized, is because they've developed a different business model than those who purport to claim there's missing money in the energy markets. The fact is, if somebody has the obligation to buy the power and somebody has the obligation to pay for it, the money will be there for sufficient capacity. Just some competitors weren't getting it, didn't like it, and used the system to drive changes in the market design to get the money instead of somebody else.
Look, that's a very powerful response to a very provocative question, and I suspect that other panelists may have they're interested in responding further on that topic. And I think the fact that it's we're pushing our end game, what I'm going to do is give each of our panelists a chance to do that, or to summarize their views on the capacity market issues, or answer another question, and after that, we're going to wrap up. So, Julia, I'll start with you, and I think Jay's comments went directly to some of what you said, so I suspect you may have something to reply about that.
Thank you, John. Well, I want to actually maybe draw some connections that Jay didn't draw, which is what we can leave aside the empirics. I'm pretty certain I can show that there are missing money problems, not just in the centralized organized energy markets that are running day ahead real time, but in the bilateral markets. There's a ton of data from the FERC EQRs to give us that emphasis too, and might be a longer discussion than what we have, but I wanted to actually draw out the reason why missing money is important, or I think should be important, Jay, to you and your members as well. Tackling the missing money problem will ensure that the markets, and here I'm not speaking just about the RTO administered markets, but the markets in general that we have, will ensure that we have long-term investment. And that, based on just the basic principles of economics, is the best way to tackle market power. I know that you had mentioned that market power is the one area where you want markets to succeed. Well, markets can succeed in doing that as long as they can provide that long-term investment signal. And it comes full circle back to the question of whether they do. And relying on energy markets in the conventional way that policymakers have in their mind, where they've equated short-run marginal cost pricing with energy markets, is not going to allow for that investment signal. So it won't allow for the type of effective mitigation of market power that you are seeking out. And that is a problem in a bilateral construct and an administered spot market construct. And I'll leave it at that just to give others opportunity to jump in.
Thank you, Julia. Pat, your turn.
Hi. Yeah, a lot here. I go back to my silver bullet slide. Again, the things that were flaws in the vertically integrated market of the 20th century, the fact that you only had real-time energy, you had to move it over long distances, that necessitated centralized power plants usually located far from population, which then necessitated a very big, robust grid to move it. I think that's a last century deal. We've still got vestiges of that. We will have them for many years. Another thing, market power. We were, as a regulator, God knows, I started my job at FERC right in the middle of the California energy crisis. Market power with a vertical demand curve looks really different if you have the ability of this demand to be much more looking like milk and gasoline and clothes and housing than it does, you know, these artificial things where you get billed a month after your consumption as opposed to seeing real-time price. And, you know, and finally again, I'm kind of tainted, not tainted, kind of shocked still by what happened in the Southeast outside of organized markets over the last half decade with Sumter and Vogtle and Kempner, these huge moonshot rate-based investments that, you know, end up being albatrosses on the back of their customers. You know, those things all need to be things of the past. So competitive markets have a lot of issues. Jay mentioned two that are near and dear to my heart, was facilitating wholesale customer open access and ability to do business. First and foremost, the co-ops and the munis that were getting squashed by the investor owns were the reason why Order 888 came in. And so allowing those little guys to play in there with the big guys and not get squashed was a big deal. We moved on to other subsidiary benefits, and one of which, of course, I've embraced deeply because I've seen it, is that shifting of risk from 100% on the back of the customer to putting it over on people who manage those risks. And the people that manage, like Dynegy that I used to chair, they're happy to take a 3% return on equity instead of a 16% regulated return on equity because that's a competitive market at work. So that money is savings for customers. It's lifeblood to our economy. It's economic development to the max. And that's fundamentally what we're about. So I'm really optimistic about the way things are going, but I know it's a bumpy road to get there. So I like looking at the horizon and not so much at the ruts in the road, but we'll figure them out.
Okay. Thank you so much, Pat. Craig, quick final statement from you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Is it unmuted?
You're unmuted.
Okay, all right, great. I'll be quick. I will just, personal confession, I just had a big birthday. I won't say how old, but I just had a big birthday, and you start thinking back. And my greatest fear, quite frankly, is that a whole generation has grown up that doesn't know why we did what we did and doesn't necessarily look back to that history of Pat Wood. My friend Pat Wood was on the battlefield in those days. I was on the battlefield, others. So at that time, we started with a regulatory system that picked winners and losers. And we said we're going to move away, sorry for the phone. We said we're going to move away from that, and we're going to let competition decide. Sorry about that. I'm going to hang it up here. It's a robo anyway. Asking for money probably. And we just decided we were going to move toward competition. But now we're sort of slipping back, or we're sort of half regulating half not regulating, picking some winners and losers, and then letting everybody compete in the marketplace. I worry when we do that, we haven't learned the lessons of why we did this in the first place. And that's one thing that does keep me up at night. I'll close with that. Thank you.
Well, thank you and happy birthday. So, Jane, final word for you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to end by agreeing with Pat very much on something, but drawing a slightly different conclusion. I absolutely agree with Pat that demand response is a critically important resource. It's enormously valuable. It's one that the cooperatives have been using aggressively for 50 years. I know of one G&T that can control 50% of its load through demand response. A lot of agricultural load that's controllable. I think we have enormous opportunities moving forwards with demand response. But I'm going to disagree that competition or freeing the retail customer is necessary to get us there. I think there are a lot of efficiencies of scale and scope doing demand response as part of the load serving entities set of tools, its resource basket for managing risk and providing better value to its consumers and its regulators. Demand response is an excellent tool for managing that risk. Consumers and their load serving entity can partner extremely well to manage this. There is a lot of CapEx investment required to do demand response very broadly and very well. And by doing it as part of an integrated distribution resource plan, something that a lot of the states are looking at these days, a lot of the utilities are looking at, doing it as part of a smart grid plan can bring that value to the consumer and then bring that demand response into the wholesale market. Again, the load serving entity as that linchpin between the retail and the wholesale. And with that, I will cut off. Thank you.
Well, and with that, I will thank a fabulous panel for a terrific discussion, great presentations. The entire webinar has been recorded and will be available for experiencing the afterglow for anybody who would like. And I will now, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to have been involved in it myself. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rebecca Lilly, who is the brains behind the USAEE's operation, to kiss us all goodbye.
USAEE wishes to thank John Jemison and the Energy Bar Association, as well as our distinguished panelists for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on USAEE's website for future download. If you're not a member of USAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.usaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I now officially close this webinar.